Good evening! In honor of my favorite holiday, I decided I wanted to stray a little bit from my typically curious maker projects and instead dive into something equally as curious, and that is the discussion of scary music and some of the elements that help create it. So let's just have a short little chat. Close enough. I made a silly, spooky Venn diagram for this first topic, which encompasses several pitch-related interdependencies. For this discussion, I'm grouping these together because I feel like it's difficult to completely separate all of them from each other when it comes to music and sound. And yes, I'm starting with one of the most cited and obvious examples in this category, which is the Jaws theme. We all know and love it. It's low, it's a minor second, it sounds like a large sea creature who's hunting you down, aided in part by the rhythm. But I think it's too simplistic to just declare that low sounds or minor seconds are inherently scary. If you were to just isolate the idea of low sounds being the key to creating scary music, you'd have to ignore the existence of a whole lot of techno and electronic music. The whole concept of the bass drop is that you're looking forward to the bass, not dreading it. There's even a whole SNL sketch about this. Although, ironically, that sketch does end in the violent deaths of everyone listening, so... On the opposite end of things, let's say you take that same Jaws theme and you pitch it up several octaves. What does that remind you of? Yep, Bernard Herrmann's soothing music to the famous shower scene in Hitchcock's Psycho. If you want to get ultra specific, and I know you do, Jaws is an E to F, and Psycho starts out with an E flat and adds an E natural, both minor seconds, and they both sound incredibly different. And part of that difference is timbre. Timbre is the tone quality of a sound. It's in part what differentiates the sound of different musical instruments. But pitch also affects the perception of timbre. It's why you can play identical notes in different octaves and think they sound like different pitches. The waveforms are different, and hence the overtones are different, so the pitches also can sound slightly different. I've seen theories that low pitches are supposed to remind our caveman brains of dangerous wild animals, and high pitches are likened to screams, and hence why we find those sounds scary. And while that sounds like a nice story to explain our human perception of things, I also think there's more to it, which I'll get to a bit later. There's not actually a single definitive definition of dissonance. It's generally accepted that they're sounds that are unpleasant or feel orally unstable. Musically, seconds, sevenths, and the tritone are considered dissonant. Other intervals depend more on context for interpretation. However, the main feature of dissonance is that it creates tension and movement. Dissonance feels like it wants to go somewhere. It wants to move forward, and especially wants to resolve to consonance. That doesn't mean it has to, because all musical rules are made up, but it is a convention that is present in a huge amount of different styles of music. But the dread of that tension, the anticipation of what's going to happen, is key to a lot of scary music. Yes, I did it. Fine, I'll quickly address the tritone. For those who don't know, it's considered either an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth. It's pretty universally considered dissonant, and it picked up the nickname the devil's interval along the way. It's often been repeated that the church banned the interval because of said associations, but come on people, the church talks about the devil all the time. They're not going to ban a vague musical reference to it. I feel like musicians should intuitively know this because both music and musicians have a pathological need to keep pushing boundaries. Try to ban an interval and suddenly everybody's using it. It is likely that interval was sometimes avoided for purely musical reasons because it's unusual and hard to resolve within the context of the music of the time. So it does seem like this turned into, at some point, kind of a little bit of early marketing magic going on here. Banned in churches all across Europe, this very tame but subversive piece of classical music contains messages from the devil. You don't want to listen to music by the devil, do you? I'm certain no fans of metal music, or Beatles fans, nor teenagers during the 1980s satanic panic fell for that sort of marketing, right? Yeah. But sure, it's dissonant and a fun reference to throw in because it's turned into a recognizable in-joke. So it's a thing. I'm sure there's a lot more you could say about it historically, and I'm aware other people have done much deeper dives on this topic, but let's move on. This is pretty simple. Rhythm is either regular or it's irregular. A regular rhythm contributes to instability and surprise, which goes a long way to keeping a listener on edge. But tied into the concept of rhythm is repetition. On the small scale, you can repeat the same note over and over again, and on the larger scale, you can repeat phrases and sections. If you spent any time on music theory YouTube, you've likely heard the phrase, repetition legitimizes. And in the context that this is referenced, that's absolutely right. But in another aspect, repetition also normalizes, and given enough repetition, repetition also de-emphasizes. If you've ever listened to a piece of music that had a steady ostinato, or a steady phrase, or a steady drone repeated throughout, over and over again, at a certain point, you kind of stop paying attention to that specific element. Just like the music that's been under this video the whole time. Did you stop noticing it? Or did you hyper-focus on it so much you didn't hear anything I said? Another way to look at it, have you ever been suddenly startled by the sound of a feral cat loudly howling outside? Just me? No, not my cat. My cat is an indoor cat. He only loudly meows inside. At first, you're not even 100% sure it's a cat. You're worried it might be a child screaming, or maybe you think animals are fighting. And then it keeps going on and on and on. And then much later, you just do your best to tune it out because it's no longer startling or scary. At this point, you just want some sleep, and it's really only the sheer volume of it all that is causing you problems. Same for screaming children in Walmart and their insanely tired parents, because at some point they tuned out those screams for their own sanity. They're far beyond being worried about what's happening because it's become background noise for them. And this is why you can't just discuss sound and music in a vacuum. It's not just that low-pitched sounds are scary or that animalistic sounds are scary. It's also the application of those sounds in a broader context. Repeat something a few times, scary. A few more times than that, tension. Repeat it a couple hundred, either boring or extremely irritating. But here's the real key. Expectation drives almost all of this, both musical and cultural expectation. Take Bach's Toccata and Fugue. Whether or not you consider it scary on its own, you likely associate that with horror or Halloween music. And part of that is because the association has been repeated enough times over the years for people to understand the reference. And where did that reference start? Primarily with silent movies and the musicians who accompanied them. Original music wasn't composed for movies at the time, and instead performers, primarily organists and pianists, use excerpts from various pre-existing classical pieces, depending on the emotion that needed to be conveyed in the scene. Toccata and Fugue frequently became a go-to piece for horror elements, and eventually appeared in the 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, further cementing the association. Over time, to facilitate quicker and easier access to music to use for silent films, sheet music books were published with suggested excerpts to use, indexed by emotion or theme instead of title. You get enough people reusing the same music to marry emotion to image, and those expectations are going to eventually stick in the larger cultural sense. expectation also guides consonance and dissonance. Not everyone can completely agree on what specifically constitutes dissonance, and not everyone has the same experience of that. I personally have listened to a lot of dissonant, atonal, and strange experimental music. I can guarantee you that my perception of dissonance is going to be different from that of someone who just casually listens to pop. Nothing wrong with that, but it's going to be hard to unsettle me with dissonance alone when I've also had the experience of really enjoying a delicious cluster chord from time to time. Also, take this study. Indifference to dissonance in native Amazonians reveal cultural variation in music perception. Whew. Published in Nature in 2016, a cognitive neuroscientist traveled to the Amazonian rainforest and conducted tests with members of a tribe who had little to no exposure to Western music. He played them various consonant and dissonant chords to gauge their reaction, and the results revealed that they found dissonant chords just as pleasant as consonant ones, including the dreaded tritone. The implication, of course, is that consonance and dissonance is purely cultural and is not biologically innate. Now, this one study isn't definitive proof, if there ever could be a thing in this type of study, and from my digging, it would appear not everyone is convinced of the results. However, I do think this is another interesting piece of the musical puzzle to keep in mind. An easier to digest example is genre. Genre is going to dictate at least some of what people expect to hear. You're usually not expecting distorted guitars at a symphony concert or opera singers at a country music performance, which means none of us can totally escape expectation. Even Schoenberg couldn't, and he tried really hard. So where does that leave us? What it comes down to, like a lot of things, is that it depends on who's listening. And the question I pose today is simply, do you think I sound spooky?